Hello everyone. Today's lesson we are talking about the sun. Now of course in our last lesson we mentioned how the sun was a star. And so just like other stars, the sun is formed from a cloud of gas and dust. If you remember our solar nebula theory from our last lesson, well that's how the sun is formed, and from that we also get the formation of the rest of our solar system. So scientists have determined that the sun and other components of the solar system were created 4.5 billion years ago. And if you think about the sort of relative size of the sun, it's huge compared to Earth. And so the last point on the slide just describes how 1 million Earths would fit inside the sun. So our sun is huge. So in our past lesson, I think we mentioned how the sun is a luminous object, which means that it creates its own light. It is a source of light. And it does this through the process of nuclear fusion. This nuclear fusion occurs in the sun's core, so the very center of the sun. The reason this sort of nuclear fusion occurs is that at the core of the sun, there is such tremendous gravity that it forces particles to collide into each other. Now, usually, from our unit in, electricity, that like charges will repel each other. Well, in the center of this core, we have a lot of like charges, which we'll get into in a sec, but these like charges usually will repel each other. But because the force of gravity is so high, sometimes it forces these particles to actually collide. And when they collide, the nuclei or the atoms will fuse together. And so that's why we call it nuclear fusion. So what's happening is we have two hydrogen atoms, and they're composed of a proton, and these two hydrogens are colliding together, fusing together to make a helium nucleus. So, of course, hydrogen and helium can be found on the periodic table. So, like I said in the last slide, we are starting with the simplest atom, which is hydrogen. And it's the simplest atom because it has only one proton and one electron. Through the process of nuclear fusion, we take hydrogen atoms and we sort of bond together their nuclei. Nuclei is just the plural of nucleus, and we form helium. Notice that in helium we have two protons and two neutrons. So it takes 4 hydrogen nuclei to fuse or bond together to create a helium nucleus. And so you see that there's no neutrons in hydrogen, and somehow they fuse together and form neutrons, and that's a much higher level of physics that we are not going to get into. And it's also worth mentioning that what I'm talking about today with you is a gross oversimplification of the process, and if you're interested in learning more, then I will try and provide some links. But we're going to keep going on with our pretty oversimplified explanation of this process. Point being, it takes 4 hydrogen to produce a helium nucleus. And these hydrogen nuclei are fusing together in order to produce this helium. So here's just another sort of visualization of this. We have our 4 protons, which are our hydrogen atoms, and they're fusing together to produce one helium nucleus. This process releases a positron and an electron. We are not going to get into what positrons are. And it also releases a tremendous amount of energy that we see in the form of light. So it says down here, starlight. I'm going to post a video below that I want you to pause this video and go take a look at that video. In that video, it explains how the sun gets its energy using a little bit of visuals. So what's interesting is this process doesn't just stop at helium. we keep getting fusion of nuclei through carbon and other nuclei until we get to an iron nucleus. So this fusion process keeps going until we get to an iron nucleus. Iron is a very heavy nucleus, so it will not fuse together with another iron nucleus. When a star runs out of its source of hydrogen and sort of moves towards being composed of these iron nuclei, it is near the end of its life cycle. And when a star sort of dies, it will experience a supernova explosion. And when you see this supernova explosion, the predominant colors that you will see in this explosion are red and yellow. And that's because of the high amounts of iron that has accumulated in the star. So if you consider our sun and its sort of life stage, we have 91% hydrogen and 8.9% helium and some trace amounts of other gases. So our star is a fairly young star, even though it has been in existence for 4.5 billion years. But because it still has so much hydrogen, it's still fairly young. Eventually, in the sun, will convert most of its hydrogen to helium and will burn out. I think estimates say around 5 billion years. So certainly not something that we have to be worried about. Now, if we take a look at the structure of the sun, we're going to see, I want you to focus on a few things. So there's the core, which is the center of the sun, and the corona, which is sort of the outside of the sun. By definition, the corona is sort of an irregularly shaped halo. So it's not the same all the way around, so that's where its irregularity comes in. And at the center of the sun is the helium core, and that's where nuclear fusion takes place. So that's where the hydrogen are fusing into the helium. The core is the hottest part of the sun. The core is about 15 million degrees Celsius, 15 million, whereas the corona is only about 2 million degrees Celsius. So we certainly can't bring any sort of man-made objects nearby because it would immediately catch on fire. So we have the corona, the outside, the core, the inside. And down here you may notice Earth at the same scale as the sun. So Earth is this tiny, tiny little dot in comparison to the sun, and if you recall earlier, I mentioned that you could fit about 1 million Earths into the space of the sun. So earlier we mentioned that the energy generated by the sun we see as light, which is true, but it's not the entire truth, because there's actually a few different types of energy, and they're all light, but we can't see all types of light. So here are the different types. The first is visible light, and so that's the type of light that we can see. And we would say that it has a wavelength between 400 and 700 nanometers. There's also ultraviolet light, which you've probably heard of before as UVA, UVB, and UVC, and finally infrared light. Now, the UV rays, or ultraviolet light, are very damaging to us. Thankfully, a large portion of UV radiation is blocked by the Earth's ozone layer. And the Earth's ozone layer is basically just a layer of ozone gas that exists in the atmosphere. So this is the chemical formula of ozone, and ozone is a very good thing when it's in the atmosphere. So UVC is pretty much entirely reflected or absorbed by the ozone layer, whereas UVA and UVB is able to reach Earth. Now UVA has a longer wavelength than UVB. What that means is that it will tend to penetrate deeper into our skin. or what is known as the dermal layer. And the effect of this is that it will cause premature skin aging and can cause the development of some skin cancers. UVB, on the other hand, will only penetrate the sort of outer or epidermal layer of the skin. It is primarily the cause of the sunburns you might acquire during the summer and is the cause of many skin cancers. So here is a diagram of the skin. And so we have the epidermis, which is the top layer, and the dermis, which is the sort of lower layer or deeper layer. And UVB will not reach the dermis, whereas UVA will. So in order to protect your skin from the sun, and you really need to protect it, you need to find a sunscreen that contains both UVA and UVB protection, and it'll say UVA and UVB on the bottle. What's interesting is the way that these UV rays cause cancer is that they will actually change the genetic makeup of the cells. So it's changing the sort of arrangement of the parts of the DNA, and this can cause cells to replicate uncontrollably, and that's what causes tumors. And so we can either have benign tumors, which are non-cancerous, or malignant tumors, which are cancerous. And it's all through the process of just changing the genetic makeup. Another way of saying that is a mutation. So again, here's my public service announcement. Make sure you wear sunscreen anytime you go outside because you are protecting your skin and protecting yourself from potentially developing cancerous cells. Okay, let's get back to stars. So, stars will have different temperatures and as a result have different colors. Now, the hottest stars are actually blue. For example, the star Rigel in the constellation Orion. Whereas the coolest stars will be more red in color, like the star Betelgeuse, also in Orion. Now, this might seem kind of backwards, especially if you consider the taps in your home, where blue is used to indicate cold and red is used to indicate hot. But instead, I want you to think about our Bunsen burner, where the safety flame was this sort of red, orangey color, and the hottest flame at the core, once you opened up that supply of oxygen, was a blue color. So hot flames are blue, and cooler flames are red. Now our star, or our sun, is a more yellowy color, and so it's a mid-range temperature star. So here is the constellation Orion, and in it we have our hottest star as well as our coldest star. So down here is Rigel. I'm not quite certain I'm saying that right. And up here is Betelgeuse, our coolest star, and it appears to be red. I'm going to post a video below, and so I want you to pause this video and go take a look at that video. Okay, let's hope that you paused the video and you're back and we're going to talk about star death. So like I mentioned earlier, we have that process of the hydrogen forming into helium and then carbon, and eventually we're going to get to iron. So this process stops with iron, and I have to be honest, this process reminds me of the game 2048, where you're combining those squares together, and you stop with sort of the tile 2048. And so this process stops with iron. The age of a star is determined by how much hydrogen is still in the star. When that hydrogen disappears, the star will begin to die. When a star dies, it will begin to collapse in on itself because the core is so dense and it just collapses in itself and causes a huge explosion that we call the supernova explosion. Pause the video. I'm going to attach 2 more videos below. One of what a supernova explosion would look like, and one about Betelgeuse. Remember, that's our red star in the constellation Orion. And so Betelgeuse, I think in the year 2019, had been progressively and rapidly becoming more and more dim. And so scientists had believed that the sort of death of Betelgeuse was sort of close to happening. Close is a relative term because it's predicted to occur sometime within the next 100,000 years. But in the last few months, the star Betelgeuse has actually become more bright again. So it might be a bit interesting to keep an eye on Betelgeuse's activity in the next couple of years to see what is really going on. Now, at times, what will happen is if the core has a lot of mass and it is so dense that there is an extreme gravitational pull, it can create a black hole. The reason for that is that if the gravitational pull is great enough, it will be able to pull in that light or attract that light and sort of suck it in to the core. So a black hole is basically just a huge gravitational vacuum that's sucking everything in, including light, which makes it appear black. So again, these black holes will only form if the mass of the star is large enough. It is important to note that black holes can form in other ways as well as through the death of a large star. So this is the end of my video, but I do want you to go check out the video that I'm going to post below. And again, this is sort of a gross oversimplification of some of these processes, but if you have any questions, let me know. And I would be more than happy to share some additional information with you. Good luck!